Hello there, folks. It's me again. It's been a while. But I saw a discussion online that warranted at least a video to sort of sum up my thoughts on the discussion. Now, to begin with, there is a video going around. This is the D&D Beyond ad that's going around. Now, this was inspired by some ads that Sam Riegel did on Critical Role. It is very 80s, sort of cheesy Saturday morning cartoon thing. And I rather enjoyed it. I thought it was playful and welcoming and sort of made me miss the old D&D cartoon, which I'm quite fond of. I grew up with. Now, the one that actually kind of got me thinking here, a friend of mine, Antoine Lavoisier, I hope I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, actually posted that it was everything he hated about the current state of D&D. Whereas I am almost on the opposite end of things. It is pretty much an example of everything I love about the current version of D&D. This sort of deeply welcoming and playful fun of Dungeons and Dragons. His specific complaint was with all of the diverse races that are there. That there are too many races that are somehow snowflake and special, and it eliminates our ability to tell diverse stories with just humans, and forces him into sort of a box that he has to play in because these are core races, and that if he doesn't use them, then he is being less than normal D&D. That's his argument as I understand it. I'm sure he will correct me if I'm misrepresenting. And this is a friendly discussion. I'm not taking like, rah, there's no rah here. This is just me trying to explain his viewpoint and why I disagree with him. So, first, this, some of his complaints actually relate to Critical Role itself, and he was complaining that Critical Role was somehow guilty of using a race as a stand-in for diversity. That's not actually what happens on the show for the most part. These races that are mostly core races, like there are two people on the show who have non-core races. We've got in the video and in the show, there are two tieflings, there are two humans, there's a half-orc, there's an Aasimar, which is unusual, and a goblin, which is also unusual. I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. Tieflings have been a core part of the game for the past two editions. They were introduced in second edition as an exotic thing that was, sort of associated with Planescape. Same with Aasimar, actually, I think, if I remember correctly. And they become less and less exotic. You don't actually have to treat them as exotic, and in fact, in Critical Role, they're not treated as exotic. The culture that these people come from, the backgrounds that the people have, is way more important than their race. The only one that actually gets any sort of weird reactions to their race is the goblin. And they address it, but it's not about them all being special snowflake races that need to be explained how they got there. The setting is written as such that, okay, they're just there. bit like going to, any metropolitan city and you meet somebody who's from Canada or Uganda or Djibouti or what have you. I mean, they have a backstory, but their backstory is where they're from, not their ethnic identity. And I think this is where I really strongly disagree with him, with Antoine. He seems to think that you need to have strong ethnic identity explanations for all of these races. And I disagree with him on that on a base level. Your setting doesn't have to be about race identity. Elves don't have to be monolithically elves. They don't have to be a monolithic culture. Half-orcs are not all from rape. We got rid of that notion years ago. Years. They're gone. There are people who still play with that, and what you do in your own private game is your business, but it's definitely not a part of Core D&D anymore, and you don't have to talk about that. You don't have to go, well, dwarves are all exactly like this. They have released some books, actually one recently, where they do talk about, like, the ethnic identity of being elves, or the ethnic identity of dwarves. But if you read the settings, very rarely does that come up. There's like a couple of dwarven cities and a couple of elven cities, and the rest of the world just considers them people. You don't need to rewrite your world to explain these races. They just are people. Just like I don't have to do a whole game about people from an Arabic culture and then explain the Arabic culture and go into great details, and you can just treat them like people. They are just like people. They are people. And his premise was that he is forced to come up with a backstory for these things rather than pay attention to the story he wants to tell. Well, tell the story you want to tell. You don't have to come up with complex backstories for these people. You can just say, he's from Waterdeep, or he's from whatever city your setting happens to have. It doesn't require it. There haven't been exotic for like 10, 15, almost 20 years. I mean, I don't get that particular argument very well, because you are not forced to do this. More to the point, you're trying to sort of reverse things. You're saying, I shouldn't have all of these options put out there in core, because I don't want to deal with those options. I want them to be some exotic thing, because that's how I see my game. And that's how you can see your game. But you're not forced to do that. If you make them exotic, and make them have to be something that you have to buy an extra book for, or what have you, then you are actually penalizing people who want to make them normal. Because they have to go buy that book. You can buy one book, and decide the races in these races, or these classes are exotic in my setting. You can make that decision. Whereas if I decide to run a game where I think Tiefling, or where I think, Aasimar or Kinku or something are a major part of the world, I still have to go buy an extra book. So, putting more options in doesn't penalize the DM who doesn't want to use them. It penalizes the DM who wants to use them. Making them normal and regular parts of Dungeons and Dragons is an aid to people who want to use them. It doesn't penalize people who don't. Now, as to the notion that they're a stand-in for racial identity in the world. That was certainly an element in maybe the 80s, some of the early 90s, but it hasn't been for a while, and it probably shouldn't be. If you want diversity and showing the differences of people's, where they come from, show it in their behavior. It doesn't matter what their racial identity, like, if a tiefling comes from Arabic culture and acts like an Arabic person, then you treat them based off of how they act and where they're from, and not by what they look like. That notion of, well, basically their mystical genetics makes it so that I have to make them weird. No, you don't. And more to the point, real diversity is, in fact, treating people like they're not unusual. Treating them like they're just people. Taking joy in where their traditions and so on is great, and understanding where people are coming from is great. But if you're telling a story about those things, that's great too, but you still don't have to do it based off of, how this person looks. Because really, D&D is not Tolkien. It is not. It is absolutely, utterly not Tolkien. It borrows some things from Tolkien, but it is a very different set of, truths to the worlds that they show. Elves in D&D have always been a bit like humans enhanced. They are not deeply alien to our way of thinking. The elves in Tolkien are much more like fair folk from like Celtic myth. They are not thinking like a human being generally. We don't do that in D&D. Same with orcs. Orcs had this horribly corrupt, they're elves that were corrupted by an evil god, and there's a whole storyline that makes sure you understand that they are completely and utterly, unredeemably evil. There is no such thing as a good guy orc in Tolkien. It just doesn't exist. Goblins are interchangeable with orcs in Tolkien. These are not true in D&D. There are no drow in Tolkien. There are in D&D. So viewing it through those lenses is not correct. They carry some similarities. Halflings probably bear the strongest resemblance to Tolkienian hobbits. The rest are wildly different. Accepting that they are wildly different is important. Because if you try and measure them by Tolkien, there's a game for that. You can play Tolkien 5e. It's Adventures in Middle-earth, which is actually a fun game. I like it. I'm not certain I would run it because I would have to reset everybody's expectations of what is normal for D&D. Because if they're D&D players, they're used to certain things that just aren't true in Tolkien. And they just aren't true in Middle-earth. And I don't think people realize how utterly different they are. If you want to play that game exists. And I actually would recommend it to people who are big Tolkien nuts. But the average D&D player wouldn't recognize a lot of this stuff. And so I think it boils down to your assumption is that, Antoine, in this, you're assuming that the world of D&D has become too diverse and too embracing of snowflake races and too, the unusual and so on. Whereas I don't see them as all that unusual, first off, and neither does D&D treat them that way. there are some cultural baggages for some, like Drow, because, well, Drow were introduced as a villain race way back when. You know, playing a goblin, well, the goblins have been a villain in D&D way back when, and it takes a long time to sort of get past that. But there have been settings where Drow are treated completely different. You are not restrained by the history of D&D. You don't have to make D&D be like 4 core races and 3 core classes like it started. You know, I've got the white box over there on the shelf. I'm not certain I would want to run white box anymore. Maybe as a novelty, but the world that they describe in early D&D is filled with preconceptions and horrible stereotypes about races and sexes and so on. We've moved past some of them, and I think we've moved to the point where we can say diversity is fine with, you know, the races, and it's not a stand-in for diversity of culture. If anything, I would say that cultures have become far more important in D&D than racial identity. You know, when you read the big adventure books that's been released by Wizards of the Coast, in this edition and the previous one, they don't spend a lot of time, up until Tome of Foes, talking about the racial identity of these people. They talk about, well, here's Waterdeep, here's Luskan, here's the setting of this adventure, here's the Sword Coast, and what you're not seeing is, here's the elven culture where you're playing this in, or here's the monolithic human culture that you're playing this in. D&D hasn't been that for a while. And, you know, it's a preconception that is wired into D&D, I will grant you, especially those of us who played for a long time. But we kind of moved past it. That's my thoughts on it. Again, this wasn't a rah. Nah. I want Antoine to do rah when he posts a reply. But yeah, this is not an anger thing. I just disagree with him, and this is why. You know, what he does in his games is what he wants to do, and what I do in my games is what I want to do. Anyway, I'm done. I will post this, and I will post more videos later. I'm about to start up a game of Midgard on Roll20, so that'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because unlike a lot of my games in the recent years, this will be mainly strangers, people I don't know. So this will be more like a convention game that just keeps going. And I'm not sure how well that's going to work out. I hope it. I'm hopeful, but I've never done one quite like this before. So I'm in virgin territory here. Usually it was you hang out with people, you find out that they play D&D, and you go, hey, let's go play D&D. Oh, you play? I play. Yeah. You want to run? Yeah, I'll run. That's how that works. In this case, I'm going to a group of strangers and saying, hey, I want to run this game. Would anybody be interested? And they have said yes. They would be interested. So I'm interested to see how it plays out. Anyway, subscribe, like, share, check out the Patreon, and have a nice day. It's the middle of the night, so it's weird saying day. But I'm a weirdo. Night.